Well, welcome to another episode of Leadership Live. My name is Steve Lowisz. I'll be your host today. Remember, Leadership Live is all about asking those questions that some people are afraid to ask when it comes to leadership and getting experts in leadership, those that are both leaders and teaching other leaders what we should do in order to effectively lead. And as always, we've got a great guest on the show with us today, somebody I've only known a couple of years, but has definitely got opinions and strong ones, which I really appreciate. Daniela, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me.
So I know you, but why don't you give a little sense of who you are, your background, and anything that would be relevant to today's conversation, as well as anything personal that you want to share, if you want to share it.
Absolutely. So, Daniela Terenzi, recently remarried, Daniela Williams.
That's right. Congratulations.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was born and raised in Romania.
Yep.
Immigrated here with my parents when I was in elementary school. I share that because a lot of the values that I learned about hard work, entrepreneurship, putting yourself out there, come from my mom and dad.
The Eastern European background, with
Yes.
mine's Polish.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're close.
So professionally, I started off my career working for Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals, business degree. Then I went on to work for Delphi. And in my professional career, I had the opportunity to lead new business development opportunities for Delphi. At the time had just spun off from General Motors.
Yep.
So all the infotainment, navigation products, spent some time in program management as well. And then I moved over into another division at Delphi Packard, which is wiring, harnesses, and connection systems. And in that role, I'm more on the back end looking at mergers and acquisitions. How do we enter into new customers, John Deere, Volvo, completely different dynamic than selling to passenger cars.
Yeah.
I share that because my entire career goal was focused on becoming a general manager, leading P&L. That was my goal.
Yeah.
And over a lunch date with the chief HR officer, they asked if I would like to go into HR.
And what was your initial reaction?
Honestly, I was having a glass of water. I almost spit it out. And I said, why do you want me to hire and fire people and give service awards, right?
Yeah.
Well, that was the only experience to date that I'd had with HR. So that was what I thought HR did. They proceeded to tell me that I knew the company inside and out, having worked in all sorts of different disciplines, how the functions worked well together, what didn't work well, et cetera. And they wanted somebody that could bring in new thinking into HR. Not knowing HR, but could you think about the talent implications that we would need to make the company successful?
Yeah.
So
and what year was that?
This was 2014, 2015.
Okay.
So a little over a decade ago. I proceeded to take on that opportunity, although I had many that would said, absolutely not. Why would you go into HR? We want you in sales. I did it for a couple of reasons. One, I was fascinated by the fact of leading a team and learning something brand new.
Yeah.
The leaders that I was going to work with were extremely challenging. And I kind of took it as, well, if I can do this, I can do anything.
That's for
and
sure.
if something doesn't work out, we'll figure it back out. I'll go back to sales.
Go back to a different role within the company and you're fine.
Exactly. So in that role, I had the opportunity to learn from the ground up anything related to business planning, talent acquisition, progression and succession. When I heard PNS, I didn't know what PNS was. How do you develop top leaders? What kind of mentoring programs should I have? And then I also spent time in labor, negotiations, attrition, everything having to do with hourly workforce and how do we grow and retain that talent.
And where has that taken you today? What's your role and your responsibilities today?
Yeah, so today I've been with Visteon for almost 7 years.
Yep.
Officially, my title is Vice President of People and Culture.
Yep.
And there's a couple different facets to the role. The main focus is I have responsibility for regions. So anything having to do within the regions of Americas and Europe.
Okay.
The way that we pay for performance, develop, leadership succession, et cetera. That's the gist of the leadership role. I have responsibility for most of the functions that report into our CEO.
Yep.
So HR business partners to the EC team are part of my team.
Yep.
I also lead all of talent acquisition globally.
Okay.
And manage the TACOE. So in some
Center of
companies,
Excellence.
the Center of Excellence is also part of my domain. And then most recently have been asked to take on workforce planning and analytics.
So would you have been as successful in your current role had you not had all that business experience prior?
No, absolutely not.
So we were just talking about Jason Leoy,
Yes.
a common friend of ours. There's another episode of Leadership Live. You got to see it with Jason Leoy. Not the typical CHRO either, because his entire background was operations, running plants, and then somebody suggested that he gets into HR after the fact. But he had to have all of that first with General Electric and some other large organizations. So some similarities
Yep.
in the two of you in the background, which is great. And he always refers back to his experience in operations, in the business, that helped him become a better CHRO today for Don Foods, as a matter of fact. But you know him.
I do know him, yes,
as
absolutely.
well. So kind of loaded question to a certain extent,
Okay.
right? Something that you learned earlier in your career that you swore by from a leadership discipline perspective, that today you look at it and say, that was a bunch of baloney.
Something that I learned that is today a bunch of baloney.
Yeah, it's total nonsense now. You used to use it. You looked at it from a leadership perspective. You thought leaders should act a certain way. You develop them a certain way. Anything to do in that leadership domain, because we all learn something at some point in our career that later on we realize that was stupid. Think about it from that perspective.
Yeah, probably the one thing that would come to mind is, as I was growing up in the auto industry, is you're surrounded by some really tough leaders that make some formidable decisions. And what I would have assessed myself, what I would have thought that I would need to do is be exactly like that kind of a role model, which I could naturally go into, but there's a heart and soul to leadership that I have to lead and feel good about what I'm doing. And I think the industry has changed. I think work has changed in that I no longer believe that to be respected as a sound leader and as a decision maker, you just have to always have it at the top, be strong, come in, make decisions, and step out. What I actually see now is that there has to be a humbleness, there has to be a humility, there has to be an ability to connect with your team or others. And you can only do that if you share your vision, but share parts of yourself. And so that there's the professional latch onto what we're doing, but there's a personal attachment to. And I think in those cases, you'll have employees on your team or others in your organization that will want to follow you.
So that's an interesting point, because that the former or the first that you described type of leadership is still pretty prevalent. And I'm not going to ask you about Visteon in particular, because that wouldn't be fair. But how do you deal with leaders that are still following leadership like that first one that you described? Because you got to experience those people. How do you interact with them? What do you do with them? And then if you think about it from a leadership development perspective, because you've got people in culture, how do you address that? How do you get them to make that shift?
Yeah, so I'll answer both with one. So the way that I address those leaders is I will watch and observe. And then for me, it's in one-on-one meetings with them. If I see a behavior that is deterrent to what the organization needs or the culture, and they're just focusing on data, but forgetting who they're impacting, in that one-on-one meeting, I will say, actually, I'll hold up the mirror and I'll say, call the person Sam. So Sam, I've noticed this. I can appreciate that you're under stress. I understand. I'll focus on what's happening so that I can relate to the business. Have you given thought to the way that you're leading? And if you continue to lead that way, would you be okay with Mary, John, and so leaving? Because right now they're on the edge and they might do that. Are you okay with that? And typically when you put it that way, and you have to do it in a sensible way, you can't attack them.
Of course.
You have to show that you understand their pain, but then you have to ask them to take a step back, almost like step out of the situation. Most cases will say, no, absolutely not. Okay, well, are you aware? Are you having one-on-ones? Do you recognize what's happening in those meetings? Because so many times they're trying to focus on getting that message out, making sure that with dominance, everybody will follow. But, right now there's a lot of there's a lot of talent out there, and there's a shortage in workforce, and so
For skills, certain skills in
absolutely.
particular, not across the board, but in certain
certain
skills,
ones, yeah.
you're dead on the money. In that kind of conversation, in anywhere in your career, have you ever had one of those go badly, that conversation? You put up the mirror in front of them and the person on the other end of that mirror was like freaking out about it, just got irate. Have you ever had that happen?
I've not had that happen.
That's good.
No, I've
That's
not
good.
had that happen.
I had it happen yesterday.
Okay.
Not,
oh, wow.
not here,
Okay.
but to an organization that I was with yesterday, and actually approached it somewhat similar to what you described. And it could have been the way I delivered it in full transparency. So we do have to be careful about that. You said that, but the response was highly negative, highly defensive until about 4.5 hours later.
Okay.
And then the person came back and said, I've thought about it. Can we have a conversation about it? And it did ultimately flip around, and we were able to have that dialogue. But I don't even know how I would respond. I'm sure my team's put the mirror up in front of my face before as well. But it is what it is. So, and think about this both in Visteon and Lilly and prior throughout your career. How do you know when somebody's going to be a good leader? When they're earlier on in their career, what do you see as the telltale signs of somebody who's got the potential to be a good leader?
So first and foremost, what I've learned in my career is you have to give them a little bit of time. I think making quick judgments within the first 60 to 90 days, you get especially if you have a new leader coming in, everybody's very high, excited about what they interviewed. They come in, what I've learned is we have to give them a little bit of time. Yeah. We have to give them a little bit of time to see if they can, number one, understand the business. Number two, do they want to shed what they knew before, but keep what's good and be able to adapt and assimilate to the culture that they've interviewed for and accepted? And then how do they then build a network? How do they influence internally with their peers? Are they building allies? And then also with their team members. How do I know if they're going to be a good leader? Is first and foremost, they have to be able to demonstrate that they understand the business.
Sure.
And it's not necessarily at a vice president or above level that they have to do this. It can be at a senior manager, at any level. Do they understand how the company is making a profit? What is the value proposition of the company that you're working for? What are those cost drivers that are impacting us? What's happening on the market? And then what role do you play? What is the impact that you have? If they can demonstrate that they are getting into that, I think that's the first key step. The next part is the ability to build allies. And why that can sound so simple, but building allies in complex organizations means that you have to know when to give and when to take.
Sure.
And we are governed by our own KPIs and metrics. Yeah. But our KPIs and metrics might be impacted by another person. They might need to hire within your region. They might need to do certain things. Your costs might go up, but we need to bring in that talent. Yeah. So building allies means that you can tell your story, understand the impact of what you need, the impact on the other individual, and then what is the overall good for the company. So those come together, and also the ability to have a vision and to bring teams together, I think is very key.
Have you ever gotten it wrong?
Oh, yes.
What happened? Without saying any names or where?
So a couple things that have happened. Number one, you can interview as great as you can, but you may not be able to understand, and best references, you may not be able to understand the human side of who you bring in, and if they can shed their past experiences. Okay. And if they have the humility to say, I still want to learn. I have been hired for something, but I still want to learn. Yep.
Growth is always a part of their process.
Yes.
But if not.
Yeah, and you don't know what they're carrying in with them. Yeah. The experience at the last company may make them fearful to also open up, right? Sure. And so that has been where we've several of us have learned along the way at different parts of my career. Like, you do what you can, but you can't. There's a human factor to humans, and that's what it is.
And getting it perfect is impossible.
It's impossible.
There's no way to get it absolutely, no matter how focused you are, and no matter how well you interview and what kind of assessments there's still, to your point, that human aspect that gets it wrong. And at times it could kind of blow up in our face. Yeah. Unfortunately. When you think about leadership development, developing emerging leaders, or even kind of middle managers into something bigger. One of the things we got to have in our back pocket is the leadership team that gets what leadership development is and the value of it and so forth. When you think about the C-suite, and I'm not just talking about Visteon, from your perspective, given the role that you're in, what do you wish that they would look at? How do you think they should look at leadership development? What do you wish they knew about leadership development that you think they don't?
I would say the main thing to understand about leadership development is that in order to make great leaders, you have to give them exposure to a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And what do I mean by that? We have to recognize that we as leaders have our own style that that has worked for us within a company, that has worked for us with our peers, that's working well. When you're looking at emerging leaders, they need to understand the culture and look to the current leadership team. But you gotta expose them to other ways of thinking, especially if you want to be able to bring in outside thoughts and be able to be, relevant in this market where you have to have a little bit of disruption from time to time.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we get so hung up in, we want you to be like this person, we're going to give you this internal mentor, we're going to give you this.
Sure.
But you're not exposing them enough to outside thinking and outside different ways of doing it. And that'll fall short. Not right away, because if they continue to follow the mold, but you got to bring in some of the additional thinking and
How do you make that happen? Like, do you have an example from your past that you were able to make that happen? And when you say you got to bring in outside people, who are you talking about? Or outside ideas?
I'm thinking about outside ideas. So one way to make it happen is one of the programs that we did at Visteon. We developed a leadership program for women, and it was focused on an Amazon model.
Okay.
You are exposed to executive coaching, internal, external, a capstone project that solves a real life business opportunity. And then you have what we call promoters that bring you into their meetings. And that was all fine and good, and it yielded what we needed to do. As we would move up and we're looking at succession, what we'll need to do more of is allow our top leaders to interact or find ways to be either in external education, seminars, etc. You've got a model, right?
Yeah, we all
we've got the 70-20-10 model, whatever it might be.
It is.
But let's not forget about that additional percentage that if you expose them to new ways of thinking, especially in this day and age with so much on automation, AI, et cetera,
Right.
you can't learn everything you have internally. It's like ChatGPT.
Oh,
Why is
sure.
it so great? Because it's not built within the framework. It's not mining data within your own company.
Yeah.
It's mining data all over.
The entire
and it
globe
gives you the
almost.
best. Yes. So we need to think about leadership in that perspective. And we shouldn't be afraid of losing leaders also. I think,
Wait a minute, stop.
yeah.
You shouldn't be afraid of losing leaders. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is we shouldn't be afraid that if we expose them to certain things that they're naturally going to want to leave. I think you're going to have people that will leave that find that they've hit a ceiling or they're not growing anymore. In this day and age, our top leaders need to consistently be curious.
Yeah.
They need to be curious, not just about their own domain, but what is the friction point that you might have in hardware, in sales, in program management? And if I can be a leader that can identify a problem in your area that maybe is impacted by my own team or another, I can really, really make a difference.
So how do you support that though? So if you're developing leaders to be curious and they become curious and somebody decides to leave, now you've got an open position. You've poured your heart and soul into that. How do you support that type of turnover? And I know I get that it's not a ton, but how do you support that internally in any organization? Because I'm sure there's somebody watching this going, I don't want to lose a frickin' leader, Daniela. I appreciate that, but I am not losing somebody that I've poured into. What's the solution on the back end of that?
But you can't really stop that person in the end.
I get it.
Right.
I understand, but somebody's thinking, I'm not doing that.
And if you're not doing that, so I guess I'll answer it in two parts. If you're not going to continue to develop your top leaders and just hope that they stay within, eventually the new outside ideas that you want to be relevant are going to stop.
Okay.
Number one.
Okay.
Number two, if you have a person that's developing that and you pour more into them, you're hoping that they're attached to that vision and you want them also from within to identify other potential leaders. That's why pipelining top talent is also very, very important. So
Okay.
that not all of your eggs are in one basket with one level of leadership, but how are you developing from within also in cases where life happens and that person might leave.
God forbid somebody gets hit by a bus even.
Or the
right?
beer bus, as we say in auto, right?
Yes, that's, the beer bus happens, and there's got to be some kind of plan there. But people are afraid of losing folks. I mean,
Yeah.
especially right now, where it seems that there's a heightened sense of fear
Mm-hmm.
about losing somebody who's really good, especially a good leader.
Mm-hmm.
But now I happen to agree with you that if it takes them outside of the organization, even if they're not a leader, anybody who's developing and has gotten to a point where they feel, look, I'm capped here, I am curious, and we've helped cultivate that. Sometimes you got to let go to grow
Yeah.
for them and for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think is absolutely fair. Let me switch gears a little bit. This is just kind of you.
Okay.
You walk into a new organization. I'm not saying you're ever going to leave Visteon, but you walk into a new organization and you're meeting with the CEO and his or her executive team for the first time. You walk in, how do you know who has the power? Who really has the power in that room?
How do you know? That's a fantastic question. Because actually, that is actually what goes through your mind. By the time you leave that
Yeah.
meeting, that is exactly what you're thinking. Am I able to influence or not?
Uh-huh. How do you pick up on who's really, because it's not always the CEO that has the power in that meeting. Sometimes it's somebody else.
Right.
How do you determine
So this is
that?
a two-person meeting. It's
Yeah,
myself
no,
and or it's a multitude of people.
It's the entire, it's the
Okay.
CEO and his or her leadership team. So let's say there's 10 or 12 people in the room and you're getting introduced for the first time, and many of our minds are, okay, who's really in control here? Who's got more say? Who's got more influence? How do you determine that? Comes up all the time.
Yeah, I would determine it. I would watch as the first time that I would watch the dynamics and watch how the conversation is led and governed.
Okay.
Is there a specific agenda that we're just following these 3 or 4 items and it's more of a check mark update, and then we're told what to do as leaders and we step out? Then clearly that the CEO has all the power. If in that meeting there's opportunity to challenge, opportunity to bring in new ideas or collaboration that might happen, I would say that power is shared amongst the CEO and also that leadership team. It's the ability to see how things are navigated and discussed.
And if the CEO holds all the power, what are you thinking? In that example that you just gave me, the CEO says, here's the 3 agenda items, this is what we're doing, now go do. How do you feel about that particular environment?
Personally, I would feel extremely stifled. I would think to myself, this is not the best way for me to work. What can I do about it?
Okay.
I was brought in, right? So I'm brought into this organization, and I'm going to think long and hard about how to approach that situation to see if I can make an impact and change parts of it. Maybe it's been that way because nobody's challenged it. Maybe it's been that way because the CEO has had some really terrible experiences and he or she feels that they have to do this. And so I'd take a step back. I would work through my network and find out as much as I can to pull information. What's happening? Why is this? What's going on with the business, et cetera? Get my facts and data.
Yeah.
And then I'd have a conversation at the right point with the CEO and ask him, and just try to get to know him psychologically, him or her again.
Him or her, yeah.
What is driving? How do you feel about how you're leading? What are the results? What has happened the last 12 months, 24 months? And then ask him, would you be open to something else like this? But in that conversation, I'd be able to gander more like, there's a reason he or she is doing what they're doing. What
Generally.
is driving that?
Yeah. Is it the business or is it the person?
Is it the business or is it the person? Is there room for change or improvement? Does it make sense to change or improve also in some situations, right? So
Yeah, it's actually one of the more common questions that I get from
Okay.
folks when they're emailing us online. Because if you do have a question, if you're watching this, feel free to email us questions for any future episode, and we'll try to get them asked and answered. In fact, some of these questions have come as
Okay.
a result of the questions that we get asked, and that's a common one. A new business, I don't know who's got the power. I got to figure out who's got the power. And if one person is holding all of the cards, what do I do when that one person is holding all the cards? And you approached it in an eloquent way, talking about the business first before just going in and saying, what's your problem,
Yeah.
dude or woman or whatever the case
Yeah.
is? Probably not going to work as well if one person is holding all the cards.
yeah.
But if they're collaborating, that does show something completely, completely different at this particular point. The toughest feedback that you've ever had to give to somebody else?
The toughest feedback.
And how did you get to the point of where you actually gave it? Again, without mentioning any names, because one of the challenges that we're seeing kind of holistically across every industry is leaders afraid right now in this economy, in this environment and everything else, to give honest feedback. So start with the toughest feedback, and how'd you prepare for that and what happened?
The toughest feedback.
You've ever given.
It's a tough one because I've given tough feedback a lot.
Which doesn't surprise me with you,
yeah,
by the
I've
way.
given tough
But-
feedback a lot.
But one that it just stands out where either it didn't go as well or it went so well, but it was a difficult conversation to have with the other person. What was it about? How did you approach it? How did you
Yeah.
prepare for it?
You know, I think some of the toughest feedbacks that I've had to give, one of them was after trying for so long to help the person turn around.
Okay.
And pouring heart and soul because I believed in the person. I also personally liked them,
Yeah,
and I wanted them to be successful. And after trying for so long and giving nuggets and following back up, to get to the point where just to let them know, unfortunately, the relationship with the business had to end, that it wasn't going to work out anymore. What also made it tough was, to them, it seemed like, where is this coming from?
Really?
And but they had excuses. And I think at that point I realized there's a lost sense of EQ along the way, that they would say the right things after feedback. And that's what happens, is they say the right things. I'm going to do it. I will. And so you're like, okay, good. We're on the track. And then 30 days later, you realize
Same thing is going on.
You took 3 steps back.
Yeah.
You took one forward, you thought, but you took 3 steps back.
Yeah.
And after that pattern for a while, I think you start to realize there's something, because you think, what am I doing? What, and you engage your other team members. There are other ways that you can support. And you finally realize there's not much more you can do. They have to absorb it. They have to want to do it. And sometimes if they can get to a point of saying, you're right, this is not working, and here's a plan that I have, you can actually make it happen, that it becomes successful. But if it's all you pulling and shaking and trying to get them on track, eventually it's not going to work out.
So what happened in that situation where you finally had that conversation after giving them the nuggets and all that? What happened?
Yeah. And unfortunately, in that one situation, we had to part ways.
Was it a quick decision at that particular point?
No, the final conversation was, is where we had to go to, but the process was lengthy to try to get them fixed and on the right track.
So if you were giving advice to a leader watching or an aspiring leader watching on how to actually approach that final conversation, what would you be thinking through? What would be the kind of the way you approach that if you were kind of teaching somebody to have a difficult conversation?
Yeah, the final conversation or along the way?
The final.
The final conversation, I would think at some point you have to remove yourself and just become a business leader in that process, and bring in facts and data of what has not worked or where you've tried. I think you have to make sure that you're always empathetic. I mean, there's a human on the other side of it that is taking this information. You have to show empathy, and but be very firm and direct with, unfortunately, here's what's happened. We worked at this. I like to ask, do you recognize this? Are you aware? We've tried it, and see where that's going. And then, unfortunately, you'll have to make the tough decision. Yeah.
But have some of it backed up with facts. But
absolutely.
You mentioned empathy, and it's a word that it's like so popular right now. Leaders got to have empathy. Leaders got to have empathy. From a leadership perspective, what's the difference between empathy and sympathy?
Sympathy is where, actually, if you're too sympathetic, you'll do the worst to that person.
Okay,
and here's why.
Say more.
Sympathy is almost like accepting a woe is me from the other person and saying, well, I'd love to be able to do this, but I've got this situation at home, or my car did this, or this other employee says. When you're too sympathetic, you're allowing that person to do the woe is me, passive aggressive, like I'm I'm a victim.
Everything's
I
out of
can't-
my control.
I can't do anything about it. And actually, it's funny because I apply so much of that with even my kids.
For
like,
sure.
how do I make sure that I teach them to be solid adults?
Yeah.
And that I can't do anything about it. It's like, but yes, you can do something about it. Empathy is being able to recognize that there is a human on the other side, but we are in a relationship here where we have to get things done.
Yeah.
And I can empathize with you and ask you, what do you need? How can I help you? But then I got to give it back to you as the adult. You now need to take it forward and do something about it.
There's still a job to be done.
There's still a job to be done.
As you just said,
Yeah.
acknowledge,
Yep.
what's the steps we can take to move forward, even if you have to modify the steps a little bit given their current situation. But the result is still, they're still responsible for the result. They're still responsible for the outcome. Do you see leaders crossing that line between empathy and sympathy too much?
Yes, I do. I do. And here's how it happens. I think the line of sympathy is crossed when we're afraid to deal with poor talent.
Keep going with
So
that.
here's what I'm saying
Okay.
is, I think in my experience, what I've learned personally is if you address non-performance directly,
Yep.
and you got to give really transparent feedback. Here's what's not working. What can we do about it? If there's a gray area, that's where it can linger on. If you address it transparently, and here's the plan, and ask for what they're going to do differently, a lot of times, if they want to, they will course correct, and sometimes you'll get the best performers out there. When you lead with sympathy, what you're doing is, I'm afraid to lose that person.
Yes.
The job is too big. The customer loves this person, but the other 9 don't like him or her because X, Y, Z. So you start to make excuses, and you're no longer addressing what's unfortunately happening to the rest of the organization that are dealing with this person, or to your stakeholders. And by not doing that, you're causing cancer in the organization. You're allowing it to fester. So your top performers are going to say, well, now I guess I can get away with this, or it's unfair if I do that. And so you're not cultivating a culture of performance because you're not addressing it. You're making excuses.
I put a post on social media this past week. It's we get what we tolerate.
That's it, exactly.
So as leaders, if we continue tolerate, again, there's a time to be empathetic. There's a time that we all have stuff that happens in our lives, and we're all going to assume that others around us will be empathetic to our situation, but we still have to get the job done. But once we start tolerating non-performance, what do we get? It's just human nature. Everybody kind of defaults to the lowest common, not everybody, a lot of people default to the lowest common denominator, and all of a sudden we've got this situation where one person has now turned into 9 people not performing because we allowed it to happen as leaders.
Absolutely.
Do you see that just in general in corporate America, based on your experience, do you see that piece happen a lot, where the leader has actually somewhat caused their own problem because they're being too sympathetic versus properly being empathizing with somebody and keeping that bar high? I see it a lot in the work that we do, but just curious from your perspective.
I see it less and less in the work that I'm doing today.
Okay.
And here's why. It can happen if you don't have clear goals and objectives.
Yes.
And if you don't have a clear communication on what does good look like, what is the performance, you will allow certain things to go on because you're not measuring. These are the 3 or 4 key things that we need to do. These are the success metrics. And how we get there, obviously you got to hit those, but it's the how and the what you're doing. But if you align yourself to goals, OKRs, KPIs, whatever it might be, and you communicate those, it takes a lot of the gray out. And they have to be measurable. So then that conversation, when you're the HR person with that leader and that employee that might not be performing, becomes a lot more objective, becomes a lot more defined, and it becomes more plan-oriented. So now what are we going to do? This is no longer acceptable. And by the way, you're not meeting your KPIs.
So let me play devil's advocate on that particular topic, just because, again, I experience this often with some of the stuff that we do. So the CEO of an organization, a manufacturing organization, not anywhere near the size of Visteon, says the only KPI that matters to us is revenue, and I'm even less concerned about that, and EBITDA. That's it. Nothing else matters. Is that enough clarity for an organization, for a leadership team to run? Just those 2 things. That's it. Because you're mentioning OKRs, which are generally a longer list of
Yeah.
things that support that. What would you say to that CEO when they say, this is all that matters to me?
Who understands how to get to the revenue and the EBITDA number that you want to get to would be the first question I'd ask him or her. And
Well, I understand it.
right, but
This is the response I got.
Okay.
I'm playing devil's advocate.
aside from you, because unless you're going to run and do everything yourself, who else understands how to get the revenue and how to get the EBITDA that you want? And then that conversation needs to take place. Well, my leadership team gets it. Okay, what role do they play? Do they understand the role that program management plays against purchasing versus sales? How does that come together? And then lower in the organization, it's a question of what role do the other employees play? What is the impact that they're making on that? Many people don't understand how they impact the financial balance sheet.
In fact, the larger the company, in my experience, the less people
Yeah.
understand how their role affects the overall organization. In fact, most of them think it doesn't.
It doesn't, right?
But that's not really true.
Right.
If we're running the business the right way, everybody has some type of impact on a customer, something internal, a process, whatever the case is, and ultimately impacts the business itself. Why do you think people don't know that? Why do you think they feel lost? That I don't know what contribution my position makes.
I don't think we as leaders have taken the time to explain it to them.
Why?
Because the organizations, what I'm familiar with, it's always been like the top does this, we need to do that, and we just tell you what to do and you do it. We have not allowed conversations to take place in, so what happens if I don't do this? What is the impact if I do it this way? We as leaders need to spend more time educating and developing our team members to what is the value that they are bringing to the organization. How do they hit that top line or bottom line? And what I have found is you can't give them an understanding of what they do 20 steps below what that KPI is.
Yeah.
You have to make it real for them within a couple, 2 or 3 items of you're actually impacting this. If you bring in the right talent, why do you bring in the right talent? Well, you have a hiring request. Okay, so be it. What if I didn't bring in that right talent? What would happen to that role?
What's the cost?
What's the cost? What is that role responsible for doing? And when I bring that person in, what am I expecting of them? So you have to take them as close to your top denominator of what you want to do, or numerator of what you want to do.
Yeah.
If you bring it in, well, I just need you to fill with the time to fill metric, they're going to only work on that. They don't care
That's the
what
only thing
that
that's
role does.
important to them.
But if you're spending time to educate and develop them on that, naturally people are like, oh, well, okay, I have the impact of a leader, even though I may not necessarily be a leader myself. As our CEO likes to say, you don't have to be anointed to be a leader.
That's true.
I love it. So
you don't have to be anointed
no,
to be a leader.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I think that's the part is we need to spend time educating.
Why do you think leaders don't do that? Because there's so many, to your point, and in my experience, is why do we as leaders forget about it, avoid it? Why?
I think sometimes we're so pushed to drive and do what we need to do that we just expect that we have a bunch of shoulders that are going to follow us through thick and thin.
Yeah.
And today's reality is not that case. These wonderful soldiers can go work for many, many companies. I don't think that us, as even ourselves as leaders, know how to communicate that message very well and translate it into what is the value of my function, my team? What is the value that I give to the company? We're so focused on, I got to hit this sales revenue. I got to deliver this part on time with this. I have to buy this material at this cost. But the overall picture, we need to spend more time thinking through that.
Because if I don't buy it at this cost, it affects this, it creates this, and we may have to lay people off because costs are too high. There's all kinds of impacts on literally everything we do in almost every single position within an organization. In fact, I would say every position within an organization, if it's structured right, if it's the right headcount, if it's the right positions, if it's all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit, you hear a lot about this idea of servant leadership. What comes to mind when you hear that term?
Yeah, servant leadership to me comes to mind is this. It's a leader that recognizes that they are in an organization and they play just as an important role, and their team members have the same equal accountability and contribution to the organization. So what do I mean by that? It is a role that is not, well, I'm the leader and you're here. In order to get to here, you have so many steps and you're not quite there yet. It's one where you say, my role as the leader, the rest of the organization has this role. Our roles are just as equally as important and impactful and as key to being retained. And so because I am the leader, what part do I play? I have to play a role where I am giving the organization enough clarity, enough vision, enough momentum and desire to achieve our goals.
Do you ever see where that term is hijacked and is taken out of context in the way people lead? Have you ever seen that? Where the mentality, I'll give you a little more kind of direction on that, where the mentality is, my job is to remove every roadblock from my team. My job is to make sure that they have every single tool that they need. And it sounds like, okay, that's a good thing, but can that be hijacked and go too far in this idea of servant leadership?
Absolutely. And I would call it as you become very territorial.
Okay.
And what do I mean about that? If you are the leader of a particular function, let's just say you're the leader of an engineering function, and you become territorial, you feel that you, to what you just said here, Steve, you have to give them the best tools. You have to make their work so much fun and so equitable in a certain way. You have to do everything for them to be able to make them successful. You then create blinders for yourself.
Yeah.
You're not able to then see who are your top performers. What do they need to be able to do? What are the gaps or friction points amongst that team or with other functions, et cetera? And so it takes you out of being a leader to almost becoming a caretaker.
Yes.
And we're not caretakers. Like even with our kids, we're caretakers to a certain point, but then you have to enable them.
We're trying to raise them to be independent.
Yes.
And what I've seen way too often, agreeing with you on this, is that people take servant leadership, the idea of it, to an extreme, and they stifle their teams. Literally, the teams stop growing. You're solving all their problems. You're doing everything for them. How are they ever going to learn how to deal with an issue? It's like helicopter parents.
Yes.
Right? We solve everything for our kids because we
Right.
don't want them to feel any pain. Well, you do that to your kid long enough, they're going to be the most spoiled, rotten kid, won't be able to function in the real world if they go off to college or whatever. And they're like, Mom, Dad, you got to pay for all this. Well, that's kind of what we sometimes create, at least from my experience that I've seen. And it's this hijack, because I ask these leaders as I observe this, and it's like, well, this is what servant leadership teaches us. No, it's not what it teaches us.
Yeah.
That's a problem. I mean, I see it as a problem.
Yeah.
Sounds like you do. It looks like you do as well.
Yeah.
So when you think about, we all have leadership traits that we go after, right? We want somebody to show these traits and these traits and these traits, and there's a lot of common ones out there. You mentioned one earlier, resiliency, and some of those are good. What's one that is so over talked about, but that in reality, in your experience, doesn't make a good leader?
What's one that's so over talked about?
Everyone just assumes a good leader's got to have this trait, but the reality of it is not every good leader has that trait. It's overblown in some instances.
I think in this day and age, as it's changed, leaders that we look to that have to be the absolute utmost experts in their domain of field. And if they are not the top experts in it,
Everything there is to know.
then they're not going to be good leaders. I think sometimes we hire for a particular position, or we look from within a company, say they have to have X, Y, Z, and they have to know this domain. They do need to know their domain and be an expert, but they have to know so much more in today's world, that if they only know their particular area, but they don't understand the impact of what it does or how that expertise needs to change with today's economy or different things, and they're not able to be moldable, I think that leader is not going to be successful. So I would rather look for a more well-rounded person that has an expertise in a certain area, but can dabble in other functions. I have found to work really well with mechanical engineers that have gone into HR.
Really?
And their ability to think and design and be organized in ME, you bring them into HR, and there's certain roles in HR that they do really, really good at. So it's a matter of being an expert, but the ability to understand the other functions and pulling that all together.
Well, and that's actually a good one. I hadn't thought about that one. Traits like they have to be exceptionally charismatic. See that on requests for leadership, it's either on a job description or those people that are going into a leadership development program. How do you view that, like a trait like that? Does that have to exist in a leader to be a good leader?
I don't think you have to be charismatic to be a... Charismatic to me is a little bit over the top. That's a really big word.
Yeah.
I'd rather see somebody that is a strong communicator, that can read the room and understand, and that can communicate clearly what he or she wants the team to do or what their vision is. I think laughing and all that, that's fun, but that's an add-on. If it's there, it's there. If you have all of that and none of the other substance, to me, then that's a terrible leader.
Yeah, in fact, I've seen some leaders that are exceptionally quiet, but when they speak,
Yes.
people listen.
Absolutely.
Right? My father-in-law was like that. He's passed now, but he didn't say much in my wife's family at all, but he's one of these guys, when he finally said something, it's like, whoa. And he was never raised his voice. I've never heard the man in 30 years raise his voice, but when he said it, people listened because so it could be either side, but it's something that often comes up. Yeah, I got good communicator's good, but I really want somebody who's a little more outgoing, a little more of the extrovert versus the introvert, which I think is crap.
Yeah.
At least from my perspective, from what I've seen. In fact, there was I don't know if it was Harvard or whoever did the study of the most successful CEOs, large company, publicly held, and then privately held company. And it was almost a 50-50 split when you think introvert versus extrovert. Communication was consistent.
Yeah.
But how they communicated was quite different. From an HR perspective, since that's your role now, what do you think is the biggest mistake HR is making when it comes to leadership development today?
I think the biggest mistake that we're making when it comes to leadership today is putting people in specific silos or buckets.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is we sometimes just look at what it is today that person has, and we are not taking enough time, especially if you're looking to develop from within. I mean, the biggest sure bet, right, is if you have somebody internally that you can develop, that's been tried or true, understands the business, that can work a lot better than the chances of bringing somebody from the outside. And I believe in both. I believe in both. Yeah.
All things being equal. Yeah.
But a lot of times what we'll do is we will focus on one or two gaps that person might have and associate that's it. They've got all these great things, but they haven't quite done this very well, and so they can only go so far. Versus taking the time to step back and understanding what is driving that person to act that way. If they're constantly in firefighting mode, what is it about their role, their leader, their customer that's putting that? Can we take enough time, as you would with a family member or a child, and say, let's talk about it, versus, hey, you're doing this. Let me understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
What would it take to give you a broader perspective on that? And just having the time to really dive into something like that versus pinpointing them and saying, well, this is all that they can do, and then saying they can't go any further.
Yeah, and I never thought of that, but when I see a lot of these emerging leaders with that organizations pick internally, and you do see some of them marked as, well, this person could probably get to this level, and this person could probably get to this level. And those individuals have only been leading for a year. Is that enough time to really figure out what they're really capable of doing? And are you setting yourself up in your organization to fail?
Right.
That's actually a really good point that I hadn't looked at it quite that way. So, and this is for you. A piece of leadership advice that you've received over your entire career. Somebody came to you and said, Daniela, let me spend some time with you, and this is something that you didn't take when they gave it to you, and in retrospect, you wish you would have at the time? So I'm kind of putting you on the spot here.
Yeah.
Because we all receive feedback all the time, and sometimes we take it and sometimes we don't, and that's the case for even the people that we give feedback to. Do you have one of those where it's like, I should have listened to that person when that person told me?
Yeah, I'll give it to where I should have listened, and I am doing it now, but I didn't at first. If that's okay to answer your question.
Yeah, for sure.
So a piece of advice as a new leader, over a decade or so ago into a role, and I was actually coming into the HR field, that I received as different types of leaders were being shown to me, especially female leaders. It was at work, they are bulldogs, they get this stuff done, etc. But there's no side of who they are as a human being. And so in the workplace, they're this such and such way. And the person giving me the advice would say, but they've actually got this other side to them. Really? We never see it. And so they'd coach that person on, you can show a little bit of this. Now, mind you, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was a different dynamic in the industry. I grew up in my leadership career being more like that, I have to get it done. The program manager in me was like, I got to get it done. We will get it done. I'm never going to fail.
Execution.
I'm not going to fail. My parents brought me here. I will not fail. We will get it done. And what happened at the time, it was, I've always set a high bar for myself, which is fine, but you can burn yourself out.
Yeah.
You can feel like you're never good enough, right? So you've got a little bit of that, oh my God, what more do I need to do? And your team around you starts to think like, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you do it, which is actually not a compliment in a way, because they're seeing something that's like, I could never be like this person. Maybe I don't even want to be like that person.
You're almost like a robot.
Yeah, you're like a robot.
Yeah.
But you're hitting your milestones. And it was a couple of years ago that I started to recognize, and even in myself, you got to talk more and show more of the human side of who you are. And so when I am in meetings, even in tough meetings, I try very hard to start off with something personal about the team. I tell the joke, I'm a big college football fan. I talk about sports, whatever it might be, just so that they can see that there's a human to Daniela and that human really cares. And so I didn't take that advice at first, but I've now started to really apply it. And it's done a couple things. It lightens tough conversations, and it allows people to see me much more relatable.
Yeah.
And when I do have to give tough feedback, they are understanding why it is, but I also work even twice as hard to send a thank you, to say really nice job, take whatever they did and bring it to my boss or other leaders and say FY, etc. So it's made me more well-rounded, and I am happier. I like myself more, and I just holistically feel better about how I lead and present myself.
The team probably likes you a whole lot more too.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Just in general.
Yeah.
We can be all driven, leaders in particular, but even individuals can be driven to a fault.
Yes.
Because they don't want to show that other side. And some of it is just the way that they were brought up.
Yeah.
I don't know about your family, but in my family, we didn't really share feelings like at all. So being quote unquote vulnerable to your team is like a foreign thing. And I unfortunately had to learn it the hard way, where I had an intervention, so let's call it, by my team some years ago. And it's like, dude, really? We know this isn't who you really are. And but it happens quite a bit. So I feel some of that pain. All right. I want to move on to the lightning round.
Okay.
I'm just going to ask you a couple of quick questions.
All right.
And just don't think.
Okay.
Just respond. One word that describes great leadership.
Humility.
Worst leadership advice you've ever heard. One sentence.
You got to be available 24 hours a day.
Okay. Last leadership book you actually finished, if you remember it.
Measure What Matters.
Okay. Early morning meeting or late night strategy? Which one's better for you?
Early morning meeting.
Okay. Your go-to question when interviewing somebody for a leadership role?
What has been your biggest accomplishment and your biggest failure?
Okay. What's more painful, annual reviews or budget planning?
Annual reviews.
And then last one, biggest pet peeves in meetings?
People, if it's Zoom not turning on their camera.
That's coming up more and more, hiding behind the can. Actually, I'm going to ask you one more, just because I know you a little bit. Coffee, tea, or just adrenaline?
A little bit of both. I like my coffee in the morning and tea in the middle of the day.
Thank you for answering that. But appreciate you coming on. I mean, there's a lot of information in what you described, and your ability to be eloquent and specific is impressive, Daniela.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for doing that. But thank you, everybody who's watching. Thank you for coming and seeing another edition of Leadership Live. If you want to be on the show, if you can pull off what Daniela did, please reach out to us and let us know. You can reach out to myself or Leah Naseda. Her contact information is probably around this video somewhere else. If you have questions, please send them in. The majority of these questions came from all of you that are watching. But again, Daniela, thank you for your time with us. some really, really great insight in what you're doing and what you've experienced, and the transition you have made is I think is probably something people are going to be looking at and going, I can do that too.
Yes.
So motivation for everybody else. So with that, we'll see you again soon. Thanks for joining Leadership Live. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.